Ex-military helps. Canine German Shepherd give birth. Then something sad happens minutes later. Jake Carter thought he had left the days of saving lives behind. But on a stormy night, everything changed. He found a pregnant canine German Shepherd, abandoned and struggling to survive. Weak. He stayed by her side as she fought through labor, bringing tiny, fragile pups into the world. It was a moment of hope, a second chance for a dog who had been left. Then, just as relief set in, something went terribly wrong. In a single moment, Jake realized this wasn't the happy ending he had hoped for. Before we reveal what happened next, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This is a story of sacrifice, loyalty, and an unbreakable bond. You won't believe what happens next. The night was darker than usual, the sky heavy with storm clouds, and the distant rumble of thunder echoed through the quiet countryside. Jake Carter pulled his jacket tighter around himself as he stepped onto his porch, staring out into the cold rain. It had been a long time since he had felt any real purpose. Since leaving the military, life had become a series of quiet, uneventful days, haunted by memories of war and the men he had lost. He had chosen solitude, hoping the silence would drown out the ghosts of his past. Then he heard it. A faint, desperate whimper carried through the rain. At first, he thought he was imagining it, just another trick of his restless mind. But then it came again, weak, barely audible over the storm. His instincts, once sharp from years of combat, kicked in immediately. Someone, or something, was out there. Grabbing a flashlight, Jake stepped off the porch and into the muddy path leading toward the dense trees that surrounded his cabin. The rain pelted against his skin as he moved cautiously, scanning the darkness. The whimper came again, closer now, and his flashlight caught movement near the base of an old oak tree. There, curled up in the mud, was a German Shepherd. Jake's breath caught in his throat. She wasn't just any dog. He could see it immediately. The strong build, the intelligent eyes, even in pain. She was a canine. He had worked with dogs like her before, during his time overseas. They were soldiers in their own right, fiercely loyal, trained to protect, to serve. But this one? She had been abandoned. Her fur was matted with mud and rain, her ribs faintly visible beneath her thick coat. But it wasn't just exhaustion that made her weak. She was pregnant. Jake knelt beside her, his heart pounding. "Easy, girl," he murmured, reaching out carefully. She barely moved, her breathing shallow, her body trembling. He could see it now, the way her belly was tense, the way she whimpered softly. She was going into labor. Damn it. Jake wasn't a vet, but he had seen enough battlefield injuries to recognize distress. This dog needed help, and she needed it now. With careful movements, he slipped his arms beneath her and lifted her off the ground. She was lighter than she should have been, malnourished, weak, but still fighting. He could feel the faint quiver of life inside her belly, the pups she was trying to bring into the world. Carrying her back to his cabin, he ignored the cold seeping through his clothes. She needed warmth, safety, a chance. Inside, he set her down near the fireplace, grabbing an old blanket and wrapping it around her. Her eyes flickered over briefly, filled with exhaustion, but there was something else there too. Trust. Jake moved quickly, lighting the fire, grabbing towels, anything that could help. He had never delivered puppies before, but he had patched up soldiers on the battlefield with nothing but a med kit and sheer willpower. He wouldn't let this dog suffer alone. As the minutes stretched into an hour, she let out a sharp whine, her body tensing. It was time. Jake stayed by her side, his hand resting gently against her back, offering quiet reassurance. "You got this, girl," he murmured. "You're not alone." And then, the first pup arrived. A tiny, wet bundle barely moving at first, until Jake carefully rubbed it with a towel, clearing its airway. A moment later, a small, fragile squeak filled the air. Relief washed over him. He placed the pup near its mother, and she nuzzled it weakly, exhaustion threatening to consume her, but instinct refusing to let go. Then came another and another. Jake worked quickly, assisting when needed, watching as new life entered the world. Each tiny pup, a reminder that hope still existed, even in the darkest moments. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last pup was born. The mother let out a long, shaky breath, her body spent. But she was alive. She had done it. Jake exhaled, his muscles sore, his heart unexpectedly full. He looked at the small litter nestled against their mother. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, purpose. Then, just as he was about to relax, something changed. The mother let out a soft, strained whimper. Her body tensed. Her breathing, once steady, began to slow. Jake's stomach dropped. He reached for her, panic rising. No, stay with me," he urged, his voice sharp. But she was already slipping away. One last breath, a final flicker of those deep, trusting eyes. And then, nothing. The room was silent, except for the soft cries of the newborn puppies. Jake sat frozen, his chest tightening. She had given everything, even her last breath. And now he was left with a litter of fragile pups and a heartbreak he hadn't been prepared for. Jake sat motionless, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The warmth of the fireplace flickered across the room, casting shadows over the mother's still body. Only minutes ago, she had been fighting for life, bringing new souls into the world. Now, she was gone, leaving behind a litter of helpless newborns who had no idea their mother would never move again. The soft whimpers of the puppies snapped him out of his trance. They needed him. Swallowing the lump in his throat, Jake reached out, his rough hands trembling slightly as he ran them over the mother's fur one last time. "I'm sorry, girl," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. He had seen death before, far too many times, but this was different. She hadn't been a soldier, a comrade on the battlefield. She had been a mother, and she had died giving everything she had for her pups. Taking a deep breath, Jake turned his focus to the tiny creatures huddled against their mother's still body. They were so small, so fragile. Their tiny bodies wriggled blindly, searching for warmth, for comfort. Their instincts told them their mother was still there, but Jake knew the harsh truth. She wasn't. His jaw clenched. They wouldn't survive without help. Moving carefully, he pulled a large, soft blanket over the mother's body, covering her in a silent gesture of respect. Then, one by one, he gently picked up the pups, cradling them against his chest, warming them with his body heat. Their fur was damp, their whimpers weak. They were hungry, searching for milk that would never come. Jake set them down on a clean towel near the fire, his mind already racing. What now? He wasn't a vet. He had no experience raising newborn puppies. Would they even make it through the night? His heart pounded. He couldn't let them die. Grabbing his phone, he scrolled through contacts, his thumb hesitating over the one name he hadn't called in months. Dr. Emily Hayes. She was a veterinarian, someone he had met years ago when she had worked with canine units in the military. They had been friends once, but life had pulled them in different directions. Still, if anyone knew how to help these puppies, it was her. He took a deep breath and pressed the call button. It rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Jake?" "It's me," he said, running a hand over his face. He barely knew where to start. "I need your help." There was a pause. Then her voice sharpened. "Are you okay?" "I found a canine," he said, glancing at the lifeless body beneath the blanket. His throat tightened, but he forced the words out. She was pregnant. I helped her give birth, but she didn't make it. A quiet sigh came through the phone. And the puppies? They're alive. But I don't know how long they'll last without their mother. Where are you? At my cabin. I'm on my way. The call ended, and Jake exhaled, relief and exhaustion washing over him. He turned back to the puppies. Some had already begun to fall asleep, curled against each other for warmth. One, however, was still squirming, a little fighter trying to move despite its unsteady legs. Jake watched as it nudged its siblings, as if trying to wake them up, as if it refused to be ignored. A sad smile tugged at the corner of his lips. You're a tough one, huh? The pup let out a tiny, determined squeak. Jake shook his head, something deep inside him stirring. He had spent so long pushing people away, convincing himself that he was better off alone. But now, staring at this tiny, helpless creature that refused to give up, something in him cracked. Maybe, just maybe, he had found something worth fighting for again. As he sat beside the newborns, waiting for Emily to arrive, Jake made a quiet promise. No matter what it took, he would make sure these pups survived. The sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled Jake's attention toward the window. She was here. He stood, his muscles aching from exhaustion, as he carefully draped another blanket over the newborn pups. The night had been long, filled with moments of hope and heartbreak. Now, he needed answers. He needed a plan. And he needed help. By the time he opened the door, Dr. Emily Hayes was already stepping out of her truck, her medical bag slung over her shoulder. Even in the dim glow of the porch light, Jake could see the concern in her eyes. She had always been sharp, observant, one of the best vets he had ever known. You look like hell, she said, brushing past him. Into the cabin. Nice to see you too, Jake muttered, closing the door behind her. Her eyes scanned the room before landing on the bundle of tiny, fragile bodies near the fireplace. Immediately, her expression softened. Oh, Jake. He swallowed hard. Their mother didn't make it. Emily knelt down, carefully unwrapping the blanket. The pups stirred, their tiny limbs twitching as they instinctively sought warmth. How long ago? Not even 2 hours, Jake said, rubbing a hand over his face. She fought to bring them into the world, then just stopped breathing. Emily nodded, her hands already moving with practiced precision, checking each pup, feeling their tiny rib cages, listening to their faint heartbeats. They're strong, she finally said, relief evident in her voice. But they won't make it through the night without feeding. Jake exhaled, tension gripping his shoulders. I figured. She looked up at him. Did she have any milk before she passed? Jake shook his head. I don't think so. Emily pressed her lips together, already pulling out supplies from her bag. I brought formula. It's not the same as a mother's milk, but it'll keep them alive. Jake watched as she carefully prepared a small bottle, the sight strangely surreal. He had spent years in war zones, patching up wounded soldiers, watching life slip away in ways that never got easier. But this was different. He had never been responsible for life this small, this fragile. Emily gently picked up the most restless pup, the same one that had fought to stay awake earlier. It squirmed in her hands, its tiny mouth opening and closing in search of something it would never find from its mother. Come on, little one, she whispered, pressing the bottle to its lips. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the pup latched on, weak but determined, its tiny tongue flicking against the bottle as it suckled. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. 1 down, Emily said, glancing at him. 5 to go. Jake moved closer, kneeling beside her. Show me how. A small smile played at the corner of her lips. You sure about that? He reached for a pup, I wouldn't be asking if I wasn't. For the next hour, they worked side by side, feeding the pups, making sure each one got enough to last through the night. Jake's large hands, once used to holding weapons, now cradled something so small, so delicate, that he felt afraid to breathe too hard. As he held the last pup, his fingers brushed against Emily's. She paused, looking at him. "You're different, Jake." He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "This." She nodded toward the puppies. "You never struck me as the type to take in something so vulnerable." Jake looked down at the tiny creature curled in his hands. A small heartbeat, steady and real, depending on him. "Maybe I'm different now," he murmured. Emily studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, maybe you are." Silence settled between them, broken only by the occasional soft whimper of the pups. The fire crackled in the background, warming the small, fragile bodies that now had a fighting chance. Jake looked at the small litter, then at Emily. "Can they survive?" he asked. She exhaled. "It won't be easy. They'll need constant care, warmth, feeding every couple of hours, and someone to make sure they're safe." Jake didn't hesitate. "Then I'll do it." Emily raised an eyebrow. "You planning to raise 6 puppies by yourself?" He shrugged. "Wouldn't be the hardest thing I've done." Emily shook her head with a chuckle. "Well, I hope you're ready for sleepless nights." Jake looked at the small, determined pup in his hand, the fighter, the one that refused to give up. "I've had plenty of those already," he said quietly. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't dreading the next sunrise. The first night was brutal. Jake had been through sleep deprivation before. Long, endless nights. On missions where even a moment of rest could mean death. But this was different. Instead of bullets and explosions, it was 6 tiny, fragile creatures fighting to survive. Their weak cries piercing the silence every few hours. Emily had left him with a list of instructions, but nothing prepared him for the reality of round-the-clock care. The pups needed to be fed every 2 hours. Every 2 hours. Just as Jake's body would finally relax, the soft whimpers would start again, forcing him awake. He had set up a system, heating pads, warm blankets, bottles prepared in advance. But exhaustion pressed down on him like a weight. By the time dawn broke, Jake sat on the floor near the fireplace, a bottle in one hand, a squirming puppy in the other. His eyes burned from lack of sleep. His muscles ached. But as he looked at the tiny creature nuzzling against the bottle, he knew he couldn't stop. A sudden knock at the door startled him. He glanced at the pups, still bundled together, warm and safe, before standing up, rubbing a hand over his tired face. When he opened the door, Emily stood there, holding 2 cups of coffee. She raised an eyebrow as she looked him over. "Rough night?" Jake stepped aside to let her in, muttering, "You have no idea." She handed him a cup, then moved toward the pups, crouching down to check them over. Her touch was gentle, practiced. "They're still warm, which is good. No signs of distress." She looked over at him. "And you? You look worse than they do." Jake took a slow sip of coffee, sighing. "I've done a lot of hard things in my life, but this might be up there." Emily smirked. "Told you, puppies are no joke." Jake sat on the couch, watching her inspect them one by one. "I don't get it," he admitted. "How do people just abandon dogs like this, especially a canine?" Emily's face darkened slightly as she stroked one of the pups. "Happens more than you think. Once they're no longer useful, some handlers see them as nothing more than equipment. And when a pregnant one becomes too much responsibility," she trailed off, shaking her head, "they get dumped. Left to fend for themselves." Jake clenched his jaw. It made him sick. He had worked alongside canines in the military. He knew their loyalty, their sacrifice. To treat them like disposable tools was something he could never understand. "They deserve better," he muttered. Emily studied him for a moment. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" Jake exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "They have no one else." A small smile tugged at the corner of Emily's lips. "Well, in that case, I brought supplies." She motioned toward her truck outside, and before Jake could protest, she was already heading back out. A few minutes later, she returned with a large box filled with formula, blankets, and pole, and tiny bottles. "You didn't have to do this," Jake said, watching as she set everything on the table. "Yeah, well," Emily shrugged, glancing at the pups. "I guess you're not the only one who can't turn your back on them." They spent the next hour working together, feeding, cleaning, making sure the puppies were thriving. Emily gave Jake more pointers, teaching him the little things that could make the difference between survival and loss. But as they worked, one of the puppies began to struggle. It was the smallest of the litter, the runt. While the others fed eagerly, this one seemed weaker, its tiny body barely responding to touch. Emily frowned, lifting it gently. "He's not latching." Jake's chest tightened. "What does that mean?" Emily's voice was softer now, cautious. "It means he's not getting the nourishment he needs. He's fading." Jake's hands curled into fists. Not again. He had already lost the mother. He wasn't about to lose one of her pups too. "What do we do?" he asked. His voice edged with urgency. Emily hesitated. "We can try tube feeding, but it's risky. If done wrong, he could choke. If we do nothing, he won't make it." Jake stared at the tiny pup, its body barely moving. He had seen soldiers fight to survive in impossible situations. Now, he was looking at a battle just as fierce, just as important. His voice was firm. "Show me how." Emily met his gaze, nodding. "All right, let's give him a fighting chance." And as Jake watched her prepare the equipment, he made a silent promise. He wouldn't let this pup go without a fight. Jake sat on the floor, his hands steady despite the exhaustion pressing down on him. The tiny runt, barely the size of his palm, lay limp against the towel. Its little chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, its body too weak to latch onto the bottle like its siblings. Emily knelt beside him, preparing a small tube and syringe filled with formula. "This has to be done carefully," she said, her voice calm but firm. "If the formula goes into his lungs instead of his stomach, it could kill him." Jake's jaw tightened. He had faced life and death situations before, but this felt different. More personal. He had watched people die in combat, had been helpless as men under his command took their last breaths. But this tiny, fragile life? He refused to lose this fight. Emily gently inserted the feeding tube down the pup's throat, her hands precise and confident. The puppy barely moved. Jake held his breath as she slowly pushed the formula through, her eyes locked on every tiny reaction. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, a sound. A tiny, weak whimper. Emily exhaled in relief. He's taking it. Jake's shoulders relaxed, but only slightly. Is that good enough? Emily sat back, wiping her hands on a towel. It's a start. We'll have to do this every couple of hours and watch him closely. But if he starts moving more, if he tries to suckle, we'll know he's fighting back. Jake looked down at the tiny pup, barely clinging to life. He had no reason to care this much, but he did. I'll do whatever it takes, he said. Emily gave him a small smile. I know you will. The next 24 hours were brutal. Jake barely slept. Every 2 hours, he and Emily took turns tube feeding the runt while making sure the other pups were strong enough to nurse. The fire crackled in the background, filling the cabin with warmth, but Jake felt ice in his veins every time the small pup barely reacted. He had already lost their mother. If he lost one of the pups too, no, he wasn't going to think like that. By the second night, Jake sat with his back against the couch, the smallest pup curled in a towel against his chest. The others were nestled together, their tiny bodies rising and falling in unison, but this one still struggled. As he stroked the puppy's fur, something in him shifted. He had spent years believing his life had no real direction anymore. His time in the military had given him purpose, but once that was gone, he had been left with nothing. Until now. This tiny life, so fragile, depended on him completely, and for the first time in years, he felt like he mattered again. Emily sat across from him, watching quietly. She didn't say much, just sipped her coffee, her gaze flickering between him and the puppies. "You ever think about what's next?" she finally asked. Jake didn't look up. "Next?" She shrugged. "You're here raising 6 newborn pups. That's not exactly a temporary job." Jake glanced down at the runt, now sleeping against his chest. "I didn't plan on this," Emily smirked. "I don't think they planned on losing their mom either." Jake exhaled slowly. "So, what are you saying?" She set down her coffee. "I'm saying that maybe it's time you stop running from life, Jake." Silence filled the room. Jake looked at the puppies, their small, innocent lives intertwined with his now. They needed him, but for the first time in years, maybe he needed them too. The days blurred together in a cycle of feedings, cleaning, and sleepless nights, but Jake didn't care. Every small victory felt like a battle won. The runt, now officially named Ace, was still tiny compared to his siblings, but he was fighting harder each day. Jake watched as Ace tried to push himself toward the others, his legs still unsteady. His siblings were already moving around the whelping area, bumping into each other, their tiny whimpers filling the room. Ace, though, struggled. His body was smaller, weaker, but his spirit? It was stronger than any soldier Jake had ever known. Emily sat on the floor next to Jake, watching the pups explore their little world. "You ever think about what happens next?" she asked. Jake kept his eyes on Ace. "Next?" she shrugged. "They won't be this small forever. In a few weeks, they'll be running all over this cabin, chewing on your boots, turning this place into chaos." Jake smirked. "Sounds about right." Emily nudged him lightly. "I mean it, Jake. What's the plan? You keeping them all?" Jake exhaled, rubbing a hand over his tired face. The truth was, he hadn't thought much past the day-to-day survival of the pups. Every waking moment had been spent making sure they lived through the night, especially Ace. Now, for the first time, he let himself consider the future. "I'll find good homes for them," he said finally. "The right people. People who'll take care of them." Emily studied him. "And Ace?" Jake hesitated. The thought of letting Ace go made something tighten in his chest. This tiny pup had fought for every breath, had pushed himself even when his body barely responded. And Jake had been there for every single moment. "I don't know," he admitted. Emily smiled knowingly. "I think you do." Jake glanced at Ace again. The pup had managed to crawl over one of his siblings, letting out a tiny, determined growl as if claiming victory. Jake chuckled. "Stubborn little guy." Emily nodded, just like his owner. Jake shot her a look, but she just smirked. For a while they sat in silence, watching the pups tumble over each other. The fire crackled in the background, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt at peace. But then, a noise outside made him tense. A car. Jake's entire body went on alert. He wasn't expecting anyone. Emily noticed the shift in his posture and placed a hand on his arm. "Jake?" He stood, his military instincts kicking in, and walked to the window. A dark SUV was parked near the tree line. The engine was still running, the headlights cutting through the fading daylight. Emily frowned. You know them? Jake shook his head. Something felt off. Then, the driver's side door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat, his face partially hidden in the shadows. Jake's stomach tightened. Whoever this was, he wasn't just passing through. Emily stood beside him now, her voice low. Jake, what's going on? Jake didn't answer. He watched as the man scanned the cabin, his gaze finally landing on the front door. Then, he started walking toward them. Jake's fists clenched. This wasn't over. Jake's body tensed as the man approached the cabin. His instincts, sharpened by years in the military, screamed that something was off. This wasn't just a neighbor stopping by. Emily sensed it too. Jake? She said quietly. Who is that? I don't know, he muttered, his voice low. But he wasn't about to wait to find out. He stepped onto the porch, planting his feet firmly as the man in the dark coat stopped a few yards away. The guy was tall, broad-shouldered, with a military stiffness to his stance. His face remained shadowed under the dimming sky. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man finally said, You have something that belongs to me. Jake's pulse spiked. His mind instantly jumped to the pups inside. No, that wasn't possible. His eyes narrowed. Who the hell are you? The man took another step forward. That dog you found, she was military property. A slow, cold anger started building in Jake's chest. She wasn't property. She was abandoned, pregnant, left to die. The man exhaled sharply, as if Jake had struck a nerve. I didn't know she was pregnant, he admitted. His voice was rough, edged with something like regret. She was supposed to be retired, rehomed. But things got complicated. Jake clenched his jaw. Complicated? That was the excuse? This had given her life for the pups inside, and now someone was showing up after the fact to make things right? The pups are mine now, Jake said evenly. They wouldn't have survived without me. The man studied him carefully. You were military. Jake didn't answer. A small nod. I figured. You carry yourself like someone who's seen battle. Jake crossed his arms. And you carry yourself like someone who's about to waste my time. The man sighed, then reached into his coat, slowly, deliberately. Jake's muscles tensed, ready for anything. But instead of a weapon, the man pulled out a file. This is her service record, he said, holding it out. Her name was Kira. She served in combat zones overseas, saved a lot of lives, including mine. Jake's chest tightened. Kira. He had never even thought to give the mother dog a name, but now she wasn't just a stray he had found in the rain. She was a damn good dog, the man continued. But when she got injured, she was supposed to be retired to a good home. I thought that's what happened. Then I got word that she'd been dumped. Jake took the file but didn't open it. His mind was still reeling. So what? You're here to take the pups now? The man hesitated. No, Jake frowned. I just wanted to make sure they were okay, the man admitted. I owed her that much. Something shifted in Jake's chest. He could see it now, the regret in the man's eyes, the guilt. They're safe, Jake said finally. I'm making sure of it. The man nodded. Then I won't interfere. He turned as if to leave, but then paused. Just one thing. Jake raised an eyebrow. He glanced toward the window, where Ace was curled up in a bundle of blankets. That runt, the little fighter. Jake's throat tightened. What about him? The man smiled faintly. Kira was the same way. The smallest of her litter, but she had more fight in her than any dog I've ever seen. Jake looked back at Ace. The pup stirred in his sleep, as if sensing the conversation about him. The man's voice was quiet. "Take care of him." Jake nodded once. "I will." Without another word, the man turned and walked back to his SUV. Jake watched as the vehicle disappeared down the road, then let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He glanced back at the window, at Ace, at the tiny life that had almost slipped away, and for the first time in years, Jake knew exactly where he belonged.